yeah, we got to overturn.
You're listening to the E-Men, inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. You know, I don't know how I was able to put together. I love that open, and somehow I put it together, which is shocking. You know, when you think about how much of a goofball I am. But welcome, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, to yet another episode of the Mike the New Haven podcast. I believe this is episode 192. It is 192, volume 17 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was also an installation of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, volume 16, with Franco Baraducci, who originally started the New York City Transit Police and transitioned into their emergency medical rescue unit. And when the merger happened in 1995, he went out to Ford Truck, the Bronx, of course, until 2003 when he went to Ray Kelly's detail. So really interesting guy with a really interesting career. And we go from him to in volume 16 to volume 17 with my next guest, who is in the thick of New York City's madness for exactly 20 years. And 15 of those years were spent doing emergency rescue work between the Transit Police and, of course, the NYPD. Emergency's their game and service their middle name, as they will often tell you. ESU is equipped to handle anything at any time, as we know. And as a medic of the unit, my next guest certainly can attest to that. For another volume of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, volume 17, of course, like I said, we're joined by Mr. John Busching. John, good evening. Welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thanks.
Good to have you here. So as far as your early years are concerned, tell me where you grew up and how much of an influence that had on you, given the career you would eventually go into.
I was born in Queens, lived there, I guess, for the first few years of my life, and then moved out to Long Island. And my family eventually settled in Rockville Center, and I grew up there, still live there. And that was pretty much my earlier years.
So coming on to the job, mid-'80s. I mean, you're in your early 20s. You just hit 20 at that point. That's such a fascinating thing that guys come on. They're not even old enough to drink yet, but they go on the fire department. They go on the police department. It's such an interesting point in one's life. And you went, as you were telling me off the air, you went to transit, not the city, not housing. So being a kid that primarily, granted, you were born in Queens, but as you said, you primarily grew up in the island. What was your familiarity with the transit police? And when they first said, "Hey, Busching, you're going to transit," was your reaction, "Ah, no"?
That pretty much summed it up. Because back then you took a test and then they told you which department you were going to, the city, housing, or transit. Right. So when I got told I was going to transit, I was like, oh my God. I had maybe ridden the subway twice as a kid. So I knew nothing about it, nothing at all. So it was quite the learning experience.
No, for sure. And it's, as I said last episode, I should say, with Franco, it's the most unique beat. And this is still true now after the merge. It's the most unique beat a cop can work because it's a city underground. You know, there's millions of people that take the trains every day. You're also factoring in the train stations above ground that you have to maintain and keep protected as well. So being 20 years old, you talked with me off the air about trying to learn to survive. I mean, you're a young man, you're coming into your own, and remove the cop aspect. At that age, everybody's trying to find their footing in the world. So tell me about finding your footing, not only as a cop, but as a person working that beat.
Again, I went into the academy at 20. I graduated also at 20. And just when I got out, I couldn't even buy my own off-duty gun because I wasn't 21 yet. I couldn't go to bars and order a drink or anything. So it was really interesting being that young and trying to figure everything out. Luckily, I had a lot of great supervisors, very senior people where I went, and they had the patience of saints, all of them. And really kind of guided me, not through just work, but, you know, when you're that young, you don't really think about consequences of anything. So they taught me a lot about everything, just growing up and responsibility and how to be careful, how to get home at the end of the night, always being vigilant, keeping your head about you. It was a great learning experience.
If you have a question for John, of course, as I always like to say, fire away. Carl Duenzel's watching, and he says, hey, Mike, great to see John. Happy to have worked with him and for him. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Carl. Appreciate you tuning in tonight. He's watching via LinkedIn. You know, there was a very, very stark reminder of the dangers of being a cop for you early on, because a year after you came on is when Robert Venable was killed. And he was, trying to respond to reports of two heavily armed men entering an apartment building, and they shot at him and the other cops he was with, and he was struck and killed. I don't know how well you knew him, but even then, it is a brother in your department who was lost. Tell me about what his loss, the effect his loss had on you personally.
Well, there was a few things, like knowing that a fellow transit officer had been killed kind of just highlighted how dangerous the job could be. But I was looking, and today I believe was the anniversary of Stephen McDonald getting shot,
Yes, it is.
and that was within a week, 2 weeks of me getting out of the transit academy, and it that really also made you take note of what kind of job you had gotten onto. That bad things happen sometimes and can leave you disabled for the rest of your life or lose your life. So it was a crazy time. Crack was just starting to rear its ugly head. Uh, Crime was way out of control at the time. So, in watching Franco talk about it, very similar experiences. I guess everybody in the subway. You were by yourself. Your radio didn't work. You rode the train from point to point all night, 8 at night to 4 in the morning, by yourself most of the time. So you really had to be alert. You had to be on your toes, and you had to know whatever you got into, it was you. It was you for quite a while. A lot of times in the subway, even if other cops wanted to help, the closest backup you had a lot of time was coming in on the next train, the next subway train. So how spaced out are the trains? 5-10 minutes. Try fighting with somebody for 5 or 10 minutes and see how exhausted you get.
Exactly. Unless you're a UFC fighter, you train for that sort of a thing, it's not going to go too well for you. And that's the thing about that beat is, and I didn't get the chance to ask about this or talk about this with Franco, and I should have. Shame on me for not. Is that naturally when you're working those shifts, even if it's a day tour, you're on your feet all day. As you said, you're riding point to point. It's a strenuous beat for any cop, but even if you're young and in shape, naturally the body gets fatigued. You get tired, you get worn out, and you might lose a little bit off your sharpness. You might lose a little bit off your instinct. And to counteract that is very, very difficult. But nevertheless, you had great teachers, I'm sure, early on, as you were just discussing. So, if anything, what were the things they told you that helped them personally fight off that fatigue that you applied?
Uh, Really, you just had to suck it up and gut it out. You couldn't afford to really let your guard down while you were in with the public. If you're on a train, you're not on a train by yourself. So you paced yourself as best you could. You did try and eat, when you had meal, and get something to drink to rejuvenate yourself. I was never a big coffee or caffeine person, so it made working the late nights a little bit difficult. But you learn to deal with it. And again, it was a lot different doing it at 21 than if I tried to do it now. I probably couldn't last two stops, but yeah.
No, it's like I said, it's a beat like no other. But you did, and before I get to the rescue years, of course, you did get some help in '90 because this I did mention last show. Bill Bratton came in as chief in 1990, and a lot of people forget. I mean, everybody remembers him for his work in Boston, obviously his 2 stints in New York, and a lengthy stint in L.A. But even though he had a great career before that, where people first came to know of him on a national stage is with the trans police. He helped you guys get federally accredited, and he implemented methods that now are commonplace, but back then were revolutionary. And he had some guy with him, perhaps you've heard of him, Jack Maple, too, which ended up, of course, becoming an equally legendary name in policing. So having him come in, talking about rejuvenation, right? How much did that rejuvenate the transit police?
I think it transformed the whole job, in my opinion. Uh, we were just almost the response agency at that point, and he just came in and was like gangbusters. He wanted full enforcement. He wanted the subways cleaned up. He wanted crime to be reduced, and we were going to do it. And all he was asking us to do was our job, to enforce the laws of New York State, the rules and regulations of the Transit Authority. And it worked. It worked unbelievably well. And it made a safer environment for all New Yorkers to be able to ride the trains safely. And there is no better way to get around, especially Manhattan, but even a lot of this city, than the subway system. It just is unparalleled, but you have to feel safe. And I don't know if that's the case right now, but certainly when I first started, it wasn't. And I saw a huge transformation to where, I think people felt pretty good about riding trains.
Yeah, I mean, it was taxi driver in New York back then. I mean, you look at cars. If you look at, and you just have to go on Google and type in New York City trains, 1989, 1990, the graffiti, even something like that.
Mhm.
It was a city in distress and a city in decay. And some people have revisionist history and they look back because they kind of miss it. But I'm like, why? Why? I mean, it wasn't a good time.
I have no idea what they missed about it. I mean, it was dirty, it was unsafe, it was unsanitary, it was disgusting. So, what you could miss about that, you got me. But I thought we, as a department, really helped in the transformation of the city. Because I've said this to my wife a couple of times over the years. The subway seems to be a barometer for the whole city. That if things start to get like really out of hand and crazy in the subway and people don't feel safe, it seems to spill over into everything else in the city. And I thought we did a really good job in starting the transformation.
For sure. Brian Keller does have a question. Thank you, Brian, for submitting. He says, Mike, can you ask John if working the 20 to 4? I'm not sure if that, maybe that's correct, maybe that's not, ever had a slow time during the night where the trains didn't have many passengers?
Later in the night, probably after 3 o'clock in the morning, it really thinned out, but it was never empty, ever. Because you would work all the time. When after I got they Franco told you TPF, Tactical Patrol Force, was who rode the trains. I did that for a year and a half, and then I got assigned to a district and ended up working midnights. So I would work from 11:35 to 8 o'clock in the morning, and there is never a period that there are no people on the trains. There's always some people on the trains, but it definitely thinned out. I would say about 3 o'clock in the morning during the week, and maybe 3, 4, 4:30 on the weekends.
Makes sense. Rick Van Leuven. Hey, Rick, retired sergeant, and of course a baseball scout too. And he brings up an interesting point. He says, I always thought that Giuliani and Bratton received too much credit for reducing crime. Jack Maple, who passed away in August of 2001 at the far too young age of 49 of cancer, was the architect of the plan that saved New York City. And that's true because I think they even made a television show. And you guys can look this up in the audience. It was called The District. It was based in Washington, but it was completely inspired. I think Jack Maple in the early seasons before he got sick and passed had a role behind the scenes. It was based off exactly what he implemented in the New York City subway system, and then later on, New York City as a whole. So that's a good point by Rick, retired NYPD sergeant, former guest of this show. So that brings us into, I guess, 1991. And what's interesting is, and you heard Franco say this, emergency medical rescue for the New York City Transit Police had a pretty good history. It had been around since the mid 1970s. Patty Pogan brought that up as well. So you're coming into a unit by that point has really refined its craft, has established its own identity, and is not only handling underground jobs but above ground jobs. If there's a major citywide job like we saw at 93 in the World Trade Center the first time, they can go assist there too. I don't know if you were already doing the volunteer work on the island as a fireman, but if so or if not, what was it that attracted you to EMRU?
I had joined the volunteer fire department as an 18-year-old.
Right.
My father was a New York City fireman, so the firefighting thing kind of got into me. But when I got on the transit police and found out about the emergency medical rescue unit, that was the only thing I wanted the whole time I was on the job, was emergency service type work. And it probably was instilled from the volunteer fire department, but I always liked the specialty aspect of things.
Now, let me ask you, because I know now the interesting thing about STS for the NYPD is it's they're not just training their own ESU guys. They'll take some guys from New Jersey and train them now. And previously, now they have their own school. They would take Port Authority guys and train them once the Port Authority police established emergency service. Did you go through NYPD's STS, or did Transit have their own school back then?
Both. When I went to Transit Rescue, we went through their version of STS, which the training sergeant at the time thought it would be good for us to start at 4 o'clock in the morning to start our training day. So we did 4 in the morning till 12:30 or something in the afternoon, I believe, and that was interesting. And then when they merged the departments, they did an abridged version of STS with the city. Stuff that we wouldn't necessarily have needed to know in the transit police. Water rescue, things like that.
Exactly. So everybody, naturally, when you think of the transit police, you think, okay, man under jobs, and yes, you worked a lot of those. I'm sure space cases. Unfortunately, there was quite a bit of those as well. But underground, listen, what did I say earlier? City within a city. Anything can happen. What does ESU respond to? Well, anything. What's the motto? Anytime, anywhere. So besides the obvious jobs of man under space cases, what else would transit rescue handle?
Well, the unit was developed originally to keep the subway system rolling. If there was somebody sick or injured on the train, that you'd have medical people to take them off the train while awaiting an ambulance. So that was the origin of the unit, the emergency medical rescue unit. So we would handle and get sent on 80 cases all over the subway system. We'd handle animal control in the subway system. We'd handle perp searches that they ran into the tunnels or onto the tracks somewhere. There was anything kids got caught in those big high wheels that spun around when you leave the subway station. They're almost like that.
Yep.
Kids would try and sneak in there and they get stuck. So you name it. And if it was in the subway system and it was above the training or the equipment that a regular patrol officer would have, then they would have us come and try and take care of it.
This is John Busching. This is volume 17 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. Happy to have John on the show tonight, former transit rescue cop, and of course later upon the merger, the NYPD rescue officer and NYPD Emergency Service Squad 7, as we'll discuss later on. So, I have to ask, animal jobs in the subway. What kind of animal jobs? Expand on that.
Dogs, cats, squirrels, raccoons, possums, snakes, lizards. Anything that they really had in the street, people would decide they wanted to transport them via subway, or wild animals would get into the system as well. So it wasn't that unusual, for us to get called. Dogs, I guess, would probably be the most common.
Yeah.
But it was just part of what we did. We had the animal control kits, the same as the city had. So whatever it was, flooding, we had pumps, fires. There were a couple of big fires in the subways that we were able to assist the fire department in different ways. Just because we knew the system pretty well, where the emergency exits were, where the access points were. We had communications, even though they weren't that great, they were still better than anybody else in the city had, as far as the fire department and the city police had talking via radio into the subway system. So, there were a variety of different emergencies that we would respond to.
And the good thing about you guys, this is what I've heard. I mean, obviously, there was a time when, as I covered many times, City, ESU, and FDNY didn't get along. Thankfully, they do now. John Norman told me this. The Transit Police's rescue unit and FDNY, at least according to him, you guys actually got along pretty well.
Yeah, because nobody really wanted to do what we were doing. So, if somebody got hit by a train, the fire department a lot of times were more than happy to let us take care of it. A lot of them were DOAs, so nobody wants to necessarily handle that aspect of it. So no, we were such a small unit. There were only 30 of us for the whole city.
Wow.
So you would put out maybe 3 trucks on average, I would say, to cover all of the 4 boroughs because we didn't go to Staten Island. Um, so we really, I never considered us a challenge or a threat or anything else. I mean, we were just kind of there, and we were handling what we would handle, and I thought we did a really good job, and I thought we really knew the train aspect of things extremely well, and that's
Now,
where it came in.
right, I didn't mean to cut you off. My apologies. Now, let me ask you, because an ESU truck is housed with the precinct. It has its own little separate station within the precinct. But transit, I'm curious, and I don't know how it was for housing. I'd have to ask a housing rescue cop how that went. But where would you guys house the trucks?
We had a separate command. We were right down the block from District 33 in East New York, or
Okay.
the Broadway Junction subway station. So we had a separate building with a parking lot and stuff, and keep all the vehicles in there and equipment and stuff like that.
Now, this was mentioned the last episode as well. Sometimes you'd have one truck for like multiple, or really the whole borough, with multiple stations, obviously, within that borough. As you were just saying, there's only 30 of you. So, excluding days in which there were major citywide jobs, like I mentioned in '93, what's some of the craziest days, craziest tours, busiest tours that you can recall where it was exactly that scenario?
There were a couple of days there that we had multiple people hit by trains in different boroughs, so you would be just driving all over the place, uh, just to get from one station to another. And again, this was before Google Maps and Waze and stuff. So you were looking at a Hagstrom map, trying to figure out how to get from where you were to what the street locate, figure out what the street location of the subway station was, because sometimes they didn't match. The name of the station didn't match the street location, so you had to look that up and then look up the route. So it was challenging at times to and then everything with us at least was what's your ETA? What's your ETA? And we're like, you got to give me a couple of minutes. I gotta So they one time they wanted to give my partner and I a complaint for failure to know our post, and we were going from like the north end of the Bronx all the way to the south end of Brooklyn. I'm like, we're gonna have to take like 5 highways, and so it was kind of ridiculous. But nothing ever came of it. But we had huge areas to cover, so sometimes we would get there first. Sometimes the fire department would get there first. Sometimes ESU would get there first. So, we learned to work with pretty much everybody because, sometimes we got there well into a job. So we would just help however we could.
Exactly. And I think people understood, listen, it's a small unit. They're trying their best, and obviously when you're covering multiple boroughs in New York City traffic, it's not easy to get there right away. Joe Maliga wants to know, what was your best collar?
Oh, my best collar. Maybe a gun collar while I was, still on patrol. A guy got into a dispute, and she decided to shoot the girl. Started to shoot at the guy. It was a whole big thing. But like a knucklehead, she stayed on the train. So we just went to a few stops ahead, searched the train, and there she was. So that was pretty good. Some robbery collars, that I made. What was funny was when I left patrol and went to EMRU, I was like, that's it. My arrest days are behind me. Central booking is behind me. Talking to the district attorneys are behind. I made more collars in the first 2 years in EMRU than I had in the first 2 years when I was on patrol, just because things, we are we're police officers, and we're in a marked car and uniform. Things happen, and
Exactly.
ended up having to make an arrest in emergency service. We pursued grand larceny collar that way in EMRU, robbery, juvenile robbery, pickup of that. Just things, somebody decided to hit somebody over the head with a 2x4 right in front of the truck. So you're out there, things happen. So which one was the best? I guess, you were the best for me or the best for them. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, make your pick. That is so interesting because, of course, ESU. For those of you that don't know, they do patrol, and naturally, even in transit, you guys are going from place to place to place. You see something, you can't say, "Listen, we're rescue cops. We don't do that." No, you're, as you said, we are a police officer. We do have to make an arrest. Rick Van Leuven, Sergeant Van Leuven, of course, wants to know. He says, besides increasing manpower in the transit system, what does John think should be done today to combat the issues plaguing the transit system? Thank you, Sarge.
It is as easy as just going back in time. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Start enforcing fare evasion right at the turnstile. You do that, and things will start going back to the way they were in the early 1990s when Chief Bratton took over the transit police. It's as simple as that. People that are going to commit crimes in the subway are not going to pay their fare. It's idiotic to think you are. So start enforcing fare evasion right at the turnstiles. Start enforcing all the little things that make people uncomfortable, begging on the trains. Even now, me going, if I go into the city, it is a very uncomfortable feeling to be in a train car and you're on a moving train and a bunch of people come in and then they start asking for money for whatever reason. They put on a little show and then they start asking for money or whatever it is. Very uncomfortable when you can't move, you can't leave. So start enforcing the rules and things will absolutely get better because we've seen it. It's not even a theory. We've already seen it proven.
I think what makes it tougher too is that there's social media. Everybody's always filming, and you can only see 20 seconds of a video, and that 20 seconds doesn't tell the whole story. So sometimes I think the other day I think there was a time where they arrested a vendor because she was there. Like they told her numerous times, listen, you don't have a license. If you don't have a license, you can't be selling your food in the subway. It's not that you're doing anything egregiously bad, but you have to get a license. So after about 20 times, naturally, they said, listen, we've warned you enough. They took her card away, but it was filmed. And of course, these poor guys got demonized and they looked like the Gestapo. It's not that they were doing. But when they found the backstory, then it made sense. But of course, the backstory wasn't as juicy, so it didn't get much coverage, unfortunately.
And I had assignments like that all the time. Again, once things started to get enforced, where you had illegal vendors and things like that, there are rules. Like there are rules that you can play music in the subway. There are rules that you can sell things in the subway, but you have to follow the rules. And if you follow the rules, then there's not a problem. If you just want to do whatever you want, now there's going to be a problem.
Yeah. Of course. Lieutenant Pete Pranzo, an author, of course, and he was a legendary lieutenant in street crime, also a former guest of this show, says quality of life enforcement was and is a priority. It works. He's right. And he would know. I mean, his days in street crime, that's exactly what those guys were doing. They helped out a lot, particularly in Harlem. Now, a couple of final notes on EMRU before I get to the merge and your entry into Truck 7 is there's if you're claustrophobic, that's really not the place for you because if there is a man under job or even if an animal gets hit by a train and you have to go get that, rather be dog, cat, whatever out, you're underneath that train if you're not jacking it up. And Franco said it. Sometimes your gun belt gets caught. I mean, it is pretty scary. You see these big old train wheels, and if they come down on you because somebody doesn't do your job right, bye bye. I mean, that's not exactly easy. I know I would pee my pants if I had to do that. So I'm sure it didn't bother you. You'd been in rescue work a long time by that point, going back to your beginnings with the volleys at 18. But still, working in a tight space like that, what helped you stay focused and not focus on, well, those risks I just mentioned?
Well, I thought the training that they put us through really helped get you over that. I mean, they had us under the trains for 3 weeks, 8 hours a day. We would just going over the train lifts over and over and over and over and over, and the construction of the trains. So that definitely helped as far as getting you over the claustrophobic aspect of being under a train. But on kind of a side note, the training sergeant was telling us when we were dealing with people under the train, always remember that somebody that's under the train was potentially there because they wanted to be there. So they're potentially suicidal, which could make them homicidal. I'm like, wow, that's a pretty black picture of, bleak picture of mankind that, somebody's. So I graduate, I'm out, and I'm under the train, and some woman had been hit by the train. She was hurt pretty bad. And, try and do what I can for her and help get her out. And she grabbed my arm, and I'm like, oh, look, she's reaching out for human contact in this most trying time of her life. And then I look at her other hand, and she's touching everything under the train to try and electrocute both of us. And it just brought home what he said. I'm like, oh my God, you know, luckily the power had been shut off. So you're always learning things and remembering things, and you have to be vigilant because there are plenty of instances where would-be rescuers end up getting attacked because the people don't want to be rescued, not just under a train, but in a lot of different.
Anywhere. No, and you know what? That's never doing that to yourself is never the answer, period, no matter what the method. But I was thinking about this when I was watching that episode of Cops that focused on the transit police, and they had a man under job where the guy was dead. And I don't know if he jumped on purpose or if he fell by accident or somebody shoved him, but he died. There's no dignity in that. Because, I mean, look, I mean, dying that way, period, yeah. But look at how these bodies look afterwards. Not that they care, unfortunately, because they're too far gone by that point. But just seeing that guy's leg, thankfully they didn't show his whole body. His leg looked awful. I'm like, that was once a human being that somebody loved.
Oh, it's a horrific way to die. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. It is a horrific way to die. If you get to that point where you're willing to have a train run you over, you have really hit rock bottom because it is not pretty. It's unfortunate.
No, very unfortunate. I mean, if you want to exit, we all know, and I've done this, so believe me, watch the Knicks. It's that simple. Just turn on a Knicks game, and if you want to have a heart attack, then it's a nice, quick way to go. I kid, of course. I don't want the show to be too bleak. But speaking of that episode of Cops, I mean, you didn't appear in it, but did they film with you guys at all? It probably didn't make the show, but did they film you guys?
Oh yeah. They filmed a few episodes with, or for a period of time, with the MRU. I like you said, I wasn't on any of that, but I remember them being there. Yeah.
So if you watched that episode, you were probably waiting to see if you came on or not. You're probably at the end of it like, they missed me. But
well, I knew, I knew when they were filming.
Yeah.
I wasn't involved in anything they were doing, but there was some good stuff that they got with guys. Foot pursuit. EMRU ended up in a foot pursuit. Somebody had stabbed a cop. The person got hit by the train. So they got to see some different aspects of what we were doing.
Yep, that was 1994, and I remember in that clip when they were going to that man under job, and you could tell this is so 90s. It was like a station wagon, an EMRU station wagon. I don't know if they got that because they wanted to fit the cameraman in the back, but it was hilarious watching this thing just chug through downtown Times Square, right over to 125th and Lenox for that man under job. So, that was a pretty good episode. It's on YouTube. It's in its entirety if you guys want to go back and watch it. So that brings us to April 2nd, 1995. That is the day in which Transit went, and EMRU was rolled into ESU. That date means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Some look at it as a good day, some as a bad day, some as a mixture of both. The 2nd of April of 95, what does that date personally mean to you, John Busching?
The people that I worked with in EMRU were fantastic. We were a very close-knit group, and we did good. But the opportunities that the city and emergency service presents to us, I would have never, ever come anywhere close if we had stayed just the transit police. So as far as me personally, the opportunities that I had in emergency service, just you were it. Like they had already absorbed housing and transit, so there was no other issue, even a small unit like the both of us were. We were it, and anything that happened, you were going, and that was just what a great feeling. It was so exciting.
Of course, absolutely. So that first day in Truck 7, feeling lucky. You walk into Brooklyn, and granted, obviously, you had experience working in Brooklyn of your stints in EMRU, covering the subway stations, and maybe even knew some of the guys that were there because of training with them or seeing them on jobs. But it's one thing to see them on jobs. It's one thing to work with them every day. And naturally, there is some nerves, not because you don't know what to do. You've been an EMRU, you've been a rescue cop by that point. 4 years, but you're working with new guys and you want to make sure that the acclimation process is easy. So that first day in 7 truck, what do you remember about that day, and how do those guys there really ease you in and make you feel welcome?
It was a tough transition at first because, for the most part, a lot of the city didn't necessarily want to be merged with transit or housing, and there were a lot of people in transit and housing that didn't want to be merged with the city. So it was a little standoffish, I think, at first. But in looking back, I think I perceived it differently than it actually was. I think that I was perceiving it as they didn't like transit cops or they didn't like transit rescue cops. And in reality, it was you just had to prove yourself no matter who you were, whether you were a city cop, a housing cop, a transit cop, you just had to prove that you belong there. Once you proved you belong there, then you were accepted. So I think looking back, my perception at the time, I think, was way off. And the reality of it was just that.
It must have been so unique for you after all those years of seeing yourself in the mirror with that transit EMRU uniform and the baseball cap with that same logo on it. Now all of a sudden, instead of transit police, it says, the New York City Police Department on the side. And then you're looking at your uniform and it says, instead of transit EMRU, NYPD Police Emergency Service Unit. And that must have been, was that a pinch me moment for you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's something about wearing the NYPD ESU patch that is just unique to anything in law enforcement, in my opinion. And again, because like transit was supposed to be mainly for the subway system, obviously, and buses and things like that. The city was the city. It was the whole city. When anybody in law enforcement needed you to do something that, again, kind of the same as the transit rescue portion of it, when they didn't have the training or the equipment, they called you. And it could be because they dropped the keys to the RMP down the storm drain, or they were getting shot at and they needed backup. So the weapons, in transit, you had your sidearm, you had a Glock 9mm sidearm, and the big advance in our armored portion was we got MP5s, single shot MP5s. Well, you would have thought that we got 50 caliber machine guns, the way that the transit authority was looking at things, or the transit police hierarchy at the time. So now you go to the city police and you have fully automatic MP5s. You had, at the time, mini 14s, you had sniper rifles, you had shotguns, you had more than one different type of handgun. In addition to your personal sidearm, you had a second gun that you could sign out, or take out off the truck and equip yourself with. And it was up to you. Whatever you felt was needed for the job was what you were given. So it was an incredible feeling to just be given that type of responsibility.
We're talking with John Busching here. This is volume 17 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. I'll continue with John momentarily. Joe Maliga is here. Billy Kennedy from One Truck, he's here tuning in tonight, and he'll be on the show next month. I mentioned Sergeant Rick Van Leuven, retired NYPD Sergeant. He's here. Pete Pranzo, Maui Swift, Carl Duenzel, who I mentioned at the top. They're all here as well, and Brian Keller as well. I want to make sure I don't miss you, Brian. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight. Like I said, you got a question for John, put it in the chat. If I don't get to it right away, rest assured I will at the proper time. That first year, you get the train derailment in Williamsburg. You get, of course, the detail UN-50 that later that year that ESU had a massive hand in. Of course, the next year was TWA Flight 800. That first year for you, and I'm not even talking about all the jobs that didn't make headlines, the perp jobs, the pin jobs, the amazing rescues. Being in the city, as you just alluded to, living through that, what was it like from your perspective?
It was incredible because even in transit rescue before the merge, I had gone to one of the planes that had gone off the runway at LaGuardia Airport and did some work there. And I did go to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, and it was like, wow, this is the biggest job I'll ever go on. And, little did I know what was coming. But then we merged, and it was like you said, just thing after thing. The Pope, that was a big thing. The Pope
Yeah.
came to Aqueduct, so I got to see the Pope in person. I mean, the heads of state, that was certainly nothing that we ever did in transit. So, and now you're on a protective detail. You're, within arm's distance of heads of state, um, the president. I mean, it was unbelievable. All the jobs. The Flight 800, I was off for, but I heard, that they had taken the issue guys and gone out there, and so I don't think they really did anything, but it was different that they were going all the way offshore off of Long Island.
Yeah.
So I mean, there were just all kinds of stuff: helicopter crashes, plane crashes, you name it, and it was happening somewhere in the city. So yeah, it was exciting, and transit rescue. We had a very limited amount of equipment, and it just seemed like the city had an unlimited amount of equipment. And then post 9/11, they had an unbelievable amount of equipment eventually, and now it's just like night and day. It's I can't believe how much stuff they have now compared to when I was there.
Me neither. And Ray Kelly, back when he was the PC, did an interview with Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes. This is around the 10th anniversary of 9/11. They profiled him. And Scott said, and he seemed surprised when he asked the question, as anybody would be. I don't blame him. He's like, "You guys have the means to take down a plane, I heard." And Ray, he played it coyly. He didn't go into specifics. He's like, "Yes, we do," and I'll leave it at that. And when I saw that interview live, my jaw dropped. I'm like, they could take down a plane? Like, who would have thought? Like, in general, even not even transit, not even housing, the New York City Police Department that maybe you had an idea about when you first came on the job, interacting with them, seeing them on jobs, they have the means to bring down a hostile aircraft. That's insane.
It's certainly nothing that you ever think. You would never even think that it would need to come to that.
Yeah.
But there was a day after 9/11 that I was my assignment for the day, as I was the door gunner for one of the helicopters. If somebody came in to the around ground zero to the unauthorized airspace, then that was supposed to be my job at the time. So you never know. You never knew what your assignment was going to be for the day.
So that brings us to 97, because I'm going to do a show on this with the guys in a few weeks from both the Bomb Squad and ESU, and one sergeant from Arson Explosion. But you guys had a terrorism scare at the UN in January. 2 truck went down with the TCB, and 1 truck was there too with the guys from the Bomb Squad. 6 months later, it came to Brooklyn, because you remember 2 Hamas guys were trying to blow up at the Atlantic Avenue subway. Joe Dolan was on that raid, Mario Zorovic, David Martinez, and that's just some of the guys. There were more, obviously. And Paul Yurku and Richard Teamsma, who used to be E-men themselves, an 8 truck, came in from the Bomb Squad and did a great job. And those 4 gentlemen, Davey, Joe, and Paulie and Richard, along with Freddie Menzalillo, will be on in a few weeks. But the next day after that job, I don't know if you were working the night it went down, but the next day, walking into the truck after some guys from 7 truck and 8 truck went on that raid, without giving anything classified away, what was the discussion like? Because that's such a unique job.
I remember I was working days, so it was either the days
Midnight.
and the midnight. I know it happened over the midnight, but I think they held the 4 to 12 over for the. But I'm not sure. I mean, it was a long time ago, almost 30 years ago now. So
25.
25 years ago. So it's the discussion was kind of like what had transpired with the team. How they made entry and what happened. They shot one of the guys, so it was kind of a big deal. The funny part, looking back on it, is we still didn't get it back then how much people around the world didn't like us. We get it now, but back then it was like, all right, some nut from overseas came and he was going to leave a bomb or whatever, but we didn't really look at it as more than it was just a really cool job.
Yeah. And it's funny because I hearken back to the John Miller, who's sadly leaving the NYPD. That's a big loss for them. His interview with Bin Laden in '98, and obviously I don't agree, but you at least gain an understanding in terms of how someone thinks and why they think that way. Because I was listening to the translations of his answers, Bin Laden's answers, and I'm like, oh, not that I agree, but I'm like, okay, so that's why. That's his justification. I guess the whole invasion of other lands, which is an issue bigger than the two of us. Not that that's the way to go about it, but it clicks now, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the more information you get, the more you can understand the whys behind a lot of things. The '93 bombing of the World Trade Center and how it tied into the 2001 attacks and things like that. So, yeah, it's interesting to look back and see how things kind of tied into one another.
I know I'm jumping ahead, and I'll go back in a second, but the reason I do that is because Joe Malika has another question. Now, you were an instructor at STS for a while, and that must have been very rewarding to parlay that knowledge from all your years in transit, all your years in city, to these new guys and gals who were so eager, as you once were when you went in first in 1991. Joe asked specifically, he's like, does John have a moment when he trained a rookie? In this case, we'll say a rookie E-man or E-girl, and later saw that guy or girl got it and excelled.
Multiples, I mean, there were so many people that came through the school that ended up doing fantastic things. I saw them on the news having gotten people jumpers off of the George Washington Bridge. Allison Esposito, she's running for Lieutenant Governor of New York. She came through STS when I was an instructor there, and she went on to become a sergeant, lieutenant captain, deputy inspector. So there's a lot of different people that have come through, and the vast majority of them have always been like, wow. There are those people that you're like, I think they're a little weak, and they surprise you and they do very well. I had a bunch of people like that I was like, I hope they passed, but I hope they continue to improve, and they knocked it out of the park. People that I saw that were, I thought, a little bit weak tactically, that ended up on the apprehension team. So they were good. It just shows that they improved their skill set considerably from when they first started.
Because when you really want something, you'll do anything to stay in that. And to your point about Allison, she just retired. Wait a minute, she was an e-cop?
For a short time, yeah.
I didn't know that. I remember because she was in the NYPD 24/7 show that they did, ABC News did many years ago, and she was still an officer. She made a couple of really good plainclothes collars. I never knew she went into ESU, but she looks like the type. She always looks like very strong and in shape.
Yeah, she did well.
Yeah.
She wasn't in for that long. She got promoted not too
Right.
long after she got out of STS, but she did well in the training. Yeah.
Yeah, good for her. Good for her, and congrats to her on her retirement because she just completed 25 years and she called it a day after, as you said, hitting inspector. So pivoting it back, and it's so tough because by August of 2001, as I've said many times, I really do think ESU was in its best place. All that expertise that came in from the merger, even if people didn't want it, the expertise of housing rescue guys, the expertise of transit rescue guys, the expertise the city guys already had. That was the most well oiled the machine I think has ever been. Not to say it's not well oiled now, but it really was back then. And then we get that terrible day that not only killed 14 heroes from the unit, but resulted in the retirements of many more good cops who, understandably, after enduring that, had enough. I think of Mark DeMarco, for example, is the most notable example in my mind of a guy who was a legendary E-man who, after something like that, in which he very narrowly escaped, walked away from the job. So that day itself, getting down there. First of all, when did you get down there? During, as the towers were on fire, or after the collapses?
After the collapses.
Okay.
I was still assigned to Floyd Bennett Field, and as an instructor. So when I came in, everybody was gone. All the vehicles were gone. So I went to aviation because I knew they would be preparing the helicopters for the high what is it? High-rise rescue plan. So I was a rappel master and also a paramedic. So figured that we would be doing different things with that. So I was there when the buildings collapsed, and the CEO of aviation came out and said, they're not going to do that. And I couldn't comprehend, because they were watching it on TV. I was outside getting the helicopters ready. So when they said the buildings collapsed, in my mind, I just thought the top had kind of snapped off at the fire line.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, what do you mean the whole building is gone? He's like, there's nothing to rappel onto. There's no more building. I'm like, what is this guy talking about? And then we went inside and saw. So they converted the helicopters from doing the high-rise rescue plan to medevac helicopters. And there was and 3 more ESU cops had shown up at that point. Another guy, Daryl Summers, was a paramedic. Tony Conti and Tommy Kirklava were both EMTs. So we split up and were assigned as a medical team to each of the 2 big helicopters for possible medevacs. So when we didn't get any medevacs, eventually we got flown in that night.
So that leads us to really one of the more incredible rescues that ESU has ever done. In their 92-year history, there's been many, but this one is in the top 10. And I don't think it's number 10. So by this point, it's John Lampkin from one truck, Scotty Strauss. I'm trying to remember who else participated in this rescue.
Patty McGee,
yes, thank you, because I knew it was somebody else. And they're working on Jimeno and McLaughlin. Kenny Winkler was there too. And Jimeno and McLaughlin, for those of you that may not know the story, they are 2 Port Authority police officers who were in the lobby of the North Tower, I believe. And as the collapse was happening, they ran into an elevator shaft. They were with 3 other cops. 2 of them were killed. One of them didn't die right away, Dominic Pizzullo, but he died of his injuries later on in the day because he was very severely injured in that collapse. But Jimeno and McLaughlin still alive, clinging to life as these guys I just mentioned are frantically working to rescue them, exhausting their bodies to a degree beyond exhaustion, if such a term is even sensical. And you're there. What was your role in that rescue? And 21 years later, almost, how do you reflect on that rescue, for lack of a better way to ask a question?
I in looking back at it and having just heard things that my father had talked about as a New York City firefighter. My brother just retired out of Rescue 3 out of the FDNY. I can't come up with anything that comes close to the scale of this rescue. Bridget Gurney, getting rescued from under the crane. I mean, that was unbelievable, huge job. This was just on a scale that was unparalleled. So it was firemen and ESU cops that just kept digging and digging and digging. Scott and Patty got Will Hamano out, and they were spent. I didn't get there until after they had left, and they ended up gaining access. Other rescues gained access to Sergeant McLaughlin. So my role was tactical medic, tactical paramedic, to do the medical care for John while he was trapped.
And getting him out, even if that was the last rescue that could be made. There were some other ones. I believe a woman was actually found by the members of Rescue 2 in Brooklyn about 27 years. Paul Sullivan found her 27 hours, after the initial collapses. She was still alive, and they were able to get her out. And I think for the 20th anniversary, they just interviewed her. So, even though it turned into a recovery effort not too long after that, and the focus turned to recovering not just your 14 fallen brothers, but certainly your friends in the fire department, your friends in the Port Authority Police, really all 23 fallen brothers and sisters from the NYPD, that moment at least had to make you feel proud to not only be an emergency service, but just to be a cop, period.
I can't even describe how proud I was to be a member of emergency service after in those, not just on September 11th, but the days after. I mean, what the unit was doing was nothing short of superhuman in just continuing to go and look for survivors, to collect remains, and then dignitaries started coming. So we had to do all kinds of dignitary protection. On top of that, it was one of the most exhausting but rewarding times in my life. I never would want to do it again, but I'm very proud that I went through it when I did. Um, throughout the night, people would rotate in and dig, and John was buried when I got to him from his waist down, laying face down, just sticking like straight out, like something you'd see in a movie, like if a transporter put somebody back together, like sticking out of a wall. That's basically what he looked like, because he was just crushed by so much concrete dust. So again, we would go in, and they said, well, you're in ESU. Do you want to stay in there and dig? And I'm like, I can't do both, because I'll exhaust myself. I'm the only medic here. So right after I went in, a doctor showed up, John Chavonis, who had come from Pennsylvania just to see if he could help, and he turned out to be a surgeon. So it was pretty good. He was a paramedic before he was a physician, so he kind of knew what I was capable of, and um, level-headed guy. He was, I believe, a captain at the time in the Army, also reserves. So he was excellent. He had an excellent treatment plan. He had a lot of courage, let us say, because he also went into this space that was, you had to go down an I-beam, kind of like this, about 20 something feet underneath the tented portions of collapsed flooring, and then lay on your stomach and crawl in about 20-25 feet, and you couldn't raise yourself up past a couple of inches, and then you were just face to face, and only one person could make contact with him at a time. So it was just unbelievable. It was simply unbelievable. In 2001, with all the rescue equipment that we had in the city of New York, between the fire department, the police department, and everybody else that was there, and we were digging this man out handful by handful with your hands, and maybe at one point I gave them a pocket face mask. It's like a plastic holder, and they broke it in half and were using those to scoop under him. So there was the big technology, New York City in 2001, how we were going to get somebody out of a building collapse. So
Go ahead. My apologies.
No, it was a rotational basis, so I couldn't stay with him the whole time because there was no roof. So I would do my medical stuff, back out, go back up, and you mentioned Billy Kennedy said hello. He was at the top of the hole where I was, and I tell him, hey, you have to see what's going on down there. And then diggers would go back down. They would rotate the firemen and SOC firemen and ESU cops, and we just dug them out by hand, and it took all night.
And I think that that's the spirit of ESU, and it's funny, you guys got recognized worldwide for that. I'm a big hockey fan. I'm a Ranger fan. And I was going through just some old footage. I love the old time hockey pre-lockout. And the Islanders home opener 2001, they're doing the player introductions, and all these guys are getting major ovations. And they had just introduced Chris Osgood, who got a loud ovation, the former Red Wings goaltender. And then they introduced Michael Peckham, who was the captain for a time. And Michael was injured, so he couldn't start right away with the Isles. He eventually did. He had a great couple of seasons there. He comes out, I don't know if you remember this, wearing a full ESU uniform onto the ice.
No, I didn't remember that.
He comes out, NYPD, there it is, the full ESU uniform, and instead of it saying E, whatever truck you're in, it says just ESU up here. But I thought that was so cool that, people really locally and in the rescue community, nationally and internationally had known about you guys. But in the aftermath, they finally but they finally figured out, wow, these guys, they're not your average unit. The work they do, rather with all that technology or by hand, is incredible life-saving work that can never be duplicated.
It's impressive. But I think it shows that it's more than equipment. It's the people that make that unit work.
Mhm.
It's the
Mhm.
people that give it the reputation that it's had. It was the people that came before me. It's the people that are in there right now that make it what it is. It is an unbelievable group of motivated people that do some extraordinary things.
I want to hit a couple more things, as I know you got to go soon. But a combat medic, I shouldn't gloss over that. For those that don't, I mean, you've probably heard it in the military sense, but as far as it pertains to emergency service, for those that may not be familiar, what is the role of combat medic or tactical medic?
Yeah, the tactical medic concept, we were all in the issue. There were some paramedics, and we weren't able to operate as paramedics. We didn't have the authorization to do it. So we really pushed to get the program accepted, and we would just do medical support for basically tactical work. So if we were on an entry somewhere and somebody got hurt, no matter who it was, we would be the ones charged with taking care of them. If we were on barricades where people were, the unit was out for quite a while in harsh conditions, it was the tactical medic that was supposed to make sure that everybody was okay and get them what they needed to keep them operational. Um, it was really giving more of a medical component to a tactical environment.
So that brings us into 2006, and you've done great for yourself on the business side of things. You have Busching Enterprises, which you can talk about momentarily. I mean, obviously, there have been a lot of factors. 9/11 was a big reason why a lot of guys who by that point had their 20 years in, if not more, left. I'm sure that played a role in your decision, but was it also the fact that, man, I really want to go into business for myself? Was it that made you say, all right, I've had a good 20 years, 15 of them in rescue, time to go?
Honestly, 9/11, I think, um, took a lot out of me as far as just, you always talk about going to the big one. When you're in emergency service, yeah, I'm going to go to the big one. Big one. Well, I went to the big one, and the big one killed a lot of people that I worked with. And in the years after that, I also went to, some pretty significant jobs. We had the plane crash right in the Rockaways.
587.
Yeah, and that was 5 minutes from Floyd Bennett Field. So we were there in less than 5 minutes. There was a class that had just started like 2 or 3 days before, and that was their first job that they went on in the issue is airliner into a community, a residential community. You know, it was unbelievable. So, you know, I think when I hit my 20 and was eligible for retirement, my son was still young, and I saw the ability to really watch him grow up. My wife is a physician's assistant. She was basically staying home, working per diem a little bit with him. So it was almost a role reversal. I was able to watch him, and she was able to work a little bit more doing what she was doing. And then the business end of it really was a complete fluke. Somebody asked me to help teach, ironically, something that I had no interest in with hazmat for back to the NYPD as a homeland security subcontractor type of thing. And they required us to, have some type of a LLC or doing business as something like that. So I got it that way. And then when I was out in California, they were filming the Oliver Stone movie World Trade Center, and they had a bunch of people from ESU in the city and Port Authority police and everything. So I went out there and asked the sergeant that I had come through the city's ESU. When I was an instructor there, how's it going? He's like, not good. They don't let us participate anymore in the city's thing. I'm like, oh, you should just hire me. I'll do it. I never in a million years thought that they would take me seriously. And next thing I know, I'm coordinating an ESU class for them.
Wow. So. I imagine when the phone call came in, wait a minute, you took me seriously?
Yeah. Like, when can you meet with the chief of department? I'm like, what? who is this? I thought it was somebody from ESU, from
Right.
NYPD issue that I work with that was just messing with me. But yeah, it worked out. It worked out pretty good, And I think it's advantageous to have people that we may deal with be trained the same way.
Mm.
So if you're training them with the same people the same way, hopefully they can operate, seamlessly when they're together. So,
Oh, of course.
all stuff like that. So that's gone by the wayside. Now I'm basically doing first line of defense classes for mass transit employees. Um, all basic stuff that we had learned in emergency service in the event of an emergency, an active shooter or bombing or chemical release, things like that.
And it's always a concern in New York City. I kind of liken it to Top Gun, like Tom Cruise said. No, you guys, we're not going to do anything with the green screen. You're going to fly planes. You're going to learn to fly planes. We'll have you trained. They trained me. That's good. I mean, if you're gonna duplicate it on television, if you're gonna see it get done in any capacity, you might as well train them in the real thing. Because sometimes you see emergency service cops on Law and Order, and then making the tactical entry. I'm like, yeah, you know what? That's exact from what I've seen from you guys. That's exactly how it would go. So it's good that you train them that way. So the hour's flown by, and it's now time for the concluding segment, rapid fire. 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You've seen the show, so you know how it goes. You can say pass. You ready?
Shoot.
Besides the people and besides the work, because that's always an easy answer, what do you miss most about the NYPD?
The big jobs.
Oh,
If
that's
there was
right.
some kind of cool job, yeah. They had somebody on the tram right after I retired. I was like, oh, I would have loved to have been there.
And you guys train there too. You guys really know how to operate in that tram. And it's not an easy environment, but you guys, of course, you master it as do the SOC guys in the FTNY, to your point earlier. Second, there's a lot of tough calls. Yes, most uplifting call, I guess, besides that rescue at the Trade Center of Jimeno McLaughlin, the most uplifting call you ever responded to.
Oh, you took my number one right off with the top. Uh, I I think even as a patrol officer, I did CPR on a woman that didn't make it, but apparently her family was very thankful that she didn't die alone. That somebody was trying to help her, and that really made me feel pretty good.
Third, funniest call you ever responded to.
A mentally disturbed person holding an iguana on a tactical entry that had the lead bunker person stop and make us like a bunch of Keystone cops just kind of boom, 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 boom. And we're like, what are you doing? Grab him, grab him. And he just turned around with the shield. And I said he's got an iguana. I'm not sure I know what that means. He's like, he could be poison. I'm like, it was, once it was all over, it was hysterical.
I'm picturing that. You come in as soon as you see that iguana. Never mind. Have a good day, sir.
Yeah.
You would have a great rest of your night. That would be me in that situation. Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City.
Katz's Deli.
Oh, that's a good answer. I've heard that. I have to go there. I think I went there a number of years ago. I have to go back. Fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would you tell the young John Busching?
Listen to more senior people. Listen. They're not just bashing you over the head with information. They're trying to get you to stay alive.
Exactly. Which is the objective in any job, especially as it involves emergency work, whether it be the fire department or the police department. Don't sign off yet. We'll say goodbye off the air. But before we go, any shout outs you want to give?
Just, keep us all in mind. Saturday, I'm going to see a former member of ESU's memorial service, Andy Stromfeld, who passed away from 9/11 cancer, and they're having his memorial service. So 9/11 is still the day that just keeps taking from us. So keep them in your thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, Andy left us last year, March 29th, 2021. That date's kind of interesting to me because that's the date, March 29th, 2002, as I've covered with my bomb squad guys. They recovered Danny Richards from the Trade Center. So it's an interesting correlation between the 29th for Andy and for Danny. Maybe they know each other, I don't know, but they're kind of connected that way. My shout out, as always, to you. Like I said, stick around, and to the chat. I mentioned a lot of you guys earlier. Ruth Ann Griffin, she tuned in. Thank you, Ruth. You're always a big supporter of the show. Of course, Billy Kennedy from One Truck will be on the show soon. David Burns, thank you for tuning in. Steven Zaslavsky. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, he participated in one of the craziest rescues in FDNY history. It happened in 1991. It was a roof rope rescue of 2 guys in Manhattan. He was there with Patty Brown and Kevin Shea from Rescue 1. Ray McCormack, who had an exceptional 39-year career with the FDNY. He'll be here for volume 21, of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. So I'm looking forward to that because I've been trying to get Ray on the show for quite some time. So it'll be good to finally have him. Ray McCormack, Best of the Bravest, volume 21, this Friday, 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. In the meantime, on behalf of John Busching, this has been volume 17 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. I'm Mike Colón. We will see you next time. And as the E-Men like to say, anytime, anywhere, anytime, baby. Take care. Have a great night.